Hello. Today is the 13th of April, 2023, and we pay homage to Bernard Rudowski, who wrote a well-known book called Architecture Without Architects. And let us begin. It's a fascinating subject because often architects think that architecture cannot do without architects, and it's simply not true. Even an architect that is very admired today, like Lebia-Suds, said that architecture has to be done by architects, but I'm not sure at all. And what Bernard Rudowski called architecture without architects prove it powerfully. But what do we see here? We see the sculpture by Constantin Brâncuș, which in Romanian is called Cumințenia Pământului, the wisdom of the earth, maybe in translation. It is a sculpture that I like very much. In its apparent primitivism, is indeed emanating a wisdom that the so-called civilized man forgot. Is the wisdom of the earth. And this wisdom of the earth, in our blindness, because I cannot call it otherwise, we forgot. Maybe we should reflect on the meanings of this beautiful sculpture and on what the earth is. Le Corbusier, and he made this statement when he was 22 years old, when he was crossing the Southeast Europe. And amazingly, we are talking about Le Corbusier. Well, future Le Corbusier, he was still young. He wrote this, which is this quotation is from a book, Journey to the East, which he made when he was around 22 years old. And it is an amazing and a paradoxical quotation. There is nothing more lamentable than this mania of today to disown tradition for the sole purpose of creating the coveted new in between quotation marks. Let's read again, because this cannot be from Le Corbusier, and yet it is from Le Corbusier. There is nothing more lamentable than this mania of today to disown tradition for the sole purpose of creating the coveted new. Wow. Here was Bernard Rudowski, the author of the book Architecture Without Architects, a very interesting Austrian architect. Here he is, Bernard Rudowski, Architetto, well, on the cover of a book by that writer, I guess, Ugo Rossi. And this is a fragment of the cover of the first edition of the book. There were several editions published, Architecture Without Architects, Bernard Rudowski. And it is a moving book. And the very idea of the book is moving, because I think we have to have the courage to recognize, that there is even genius in people whose names we do not know. After all, do we know the names of the builders of the Chartres Cathedral? No. Well, they had master builders, of course, very knowledgeable, but anonymously so. But they didn't erect the cathedral by themselves. They were surrounded by older people, women, children. Everybody contributed to the rebuilding of Chartres Cathedral in just 25 years. They rebuilt it because the first one fell prey to fire. In 25 years, a little town, 25,000 people, Chartres in the Middle Ages, in the 12th century, rebuilt Chartres Cathedral, and it's a sublime cathedral. While New York City, which has over 50 million people, all the technology in the world, all the money in the world, they cannot finish St. John the Divine Cathedral, which is essentially a pastiche. It's the largest cathedral on earth, but it's a pastiche. It is impressive through its dimensions, but it cannot be finished. And it's not because there is no money or technology. No, or people. Faith is missing. Exactly that faith that is the last word of the short Bauhaus manifesto that Walter Gropius wrote in 1919. So in 1919, the founder of the Bauhaus wrote a short manifesto which ends with this very word. And it's truly short, that manifesto, like half a page. Faith. And twice in that short manifesto, he uses the word heavens. Not to speak about the fact that he differentiates between the craftsman and the artist, both being rooted in craft, but he said that the artist is an exalted craftsman, that is, arrived at exaltation. Well, how many architects today are exalted? But these people, these humble people without names, built incredible architecture, non-pedigreed architecture, as Bernard Rudowski called it, architecture without architects. So in this book, Bernard Rudowski steps outside the narrowly defined discipline that has governed our sense of architectural history and discusses the art of building as a universal phenomenon. He introduces the reader to communal architecture produced not by specialists, but by the spontaneous and continuing activity of a whole people with a common heritage, acting within a community or communal experience. A prehistoric theater district for 100,000 spectators on the American continent, and then underground towns and villages, complete with schools, offices, and factories, inhabited by millions of people, are among the unexpected phenomena he brings to light. The beauty of primitive architecture has often been dismissed as accidental, but today we recognize in it an art form that has resulted from human intelligence applied to uniquely human modes of life. Indeed, Rudowski sees the philosophy and practical knowledge of the untutored builders as untapped sources of inspiration for industrial men trapped in his chaotic cities. New York, the Museum of Modern Art published on the occasion of the exhibition Architecture Without Architects, shown at the MoMA in 1964, from November 9th, 1964 to February 7th, 1965. And now I show images from the book, all amazingly fresh and new to the dogmatic, bureaucratized, tamed architect. I mean, how many architects today would be like this? Almost none. Almost none. And how do you explain it? We have money, we have enlightened beneficiaries or clients, we have technology, but we don't have heart any longer. We don't have soul. We don't have that soul that Stephen Hall said is more important. Well, the ideal is more important than the real. He said, remain idealistic. Stephen Hall said, remain idealistic. The soul needs the ideal more than the real. But this is not the conception of the highly trained but tamed architects of today. They would not be like this. No. Now, of course, we have our own problems. We have, hundreds of millions of people. We have billions of people. But we move a lot. We are not building for a certain place where we live. We do not live where we build. That's a problem. We build for some place on earth, but not our own place. And this way we are very different from the mollusk, because Gaston Bachelard was correct when he differentiated or opposed the mollusk to the human being. He said the mollusk doesn't build in order to live, doesn't build its house in order to live, but lives in order to build its house. This is a fundamental difference. The house of the mollusk is the culmination of a lived life, is the expression of a lived life, just like these buildings are expressions of the lived lives of the builders. These people build their buildings not in order to quickly move in and watch TV as we do, but the buildings are intrinsic proofs of their lives, and not just the connection with the outer world, with what we call the landscape, but also intimate, accurate, affectionate expressions of their own inner world, imagination, memory, longings, maybe nightmares, the soul. The soul, what is this word? A student many years ago at Columbia University in New York told me that this word does not exist on the campus of Columbia University. Well, I don't know if he was quite right, because Stephen Hall teaches at Columbia University, and it was him who said the soul needs the ideal more than the real. Now, of course, we have to explain to ourselves first, what does he mean by the ideal? What is the ideal? Right? Look at this. Should we call it ruralism? Should we call it urbanism, or we should just get rid of ISM at the end? And I think we should. This is the spontaneous order of nature, but this is the spontaneous order of human nature, because they built this, human settlement in this way, which no architect with high training, tamed as he or she is, would do something like this, because it would be considered irrational, dangerous, unhealthy, when in fact it could be so, but it's also magical. Is our architecture magical? Very rarely. Look at this. They are builders. We only see their legs transporting a roof. I'm sure they enjoy themselves. Could we say the same thing about the highly trained architect of today? I doubt it. No architect today would transport with some colleagues or some friends or some neighbors a roof as these people do. It's a delicious photograph. Let's look at it again. Look here. Would 4 architects today do something like this? Of course not. We are too serious. First of all, we are white collar architects, right? Professionals. We are professionals. We are specialists. We forgetting what Walter Gropius, again, the founder of the Bauhaus, said. He was making fun of the specialists. He said, the specialist is the one who repeats the same mistakes over and over again. And Alvar Aalto also was an adversary, an enemy of the specialist. They both were against specialization. And Le Corbusier notoriously said that architecture is not a profession, but a state of mind. Well, here we have 3, if I can call them giants of the modern movement, saying almost the same thing. Again, we look at this picture. I feel that these people are enjoying themselves. They are, yes, they die young, much younger than us. We have longer lives. We drag ourselves, into the night, in the around 90, being 90 years old. But, maybe we never lived. Maybe we just laid on the sofa and watched TVs and did, standardized work in some office, bureaucratized work. I read recently that a famous Roman emperor, Marcus Aurelius, he said, we shouldn't be so concerned with dying. We shouldn't be afraid of dying. We should be afraid of not starting to live. And I think many people, if not most people, do not start living. In fact, they die without living. And they die because they rejected the very idea to start living. Many people are so. Yes, they escape to amusement parks. They escape if they have money to expensive resorts. They expel themselves from the realm of real life into some exoticism. But in essence, they don't live. Look at these buildings. No student, in at least in our university system, would dare to imagine such a container, such a building. No way. We have to use the T-square and the rectangle, even 30 years after the arrival of the computer, more than 30 years actually. But this kind of voluptuous, almost container building is inconceivable even by the imagination of a young student. Why? Because we are deprived of our connection with our deeper self. That's why. And we are afraid to dream. Yes, there are. If you are so kind, there is a noise in the background. Please turn off the microphone unless you want to say something. Thank you very much. I love these buildings. They are mysterious. They are different. They are other. They are unique. This happens, that is from Romania, and it's in that book, Architecture Without Architects. This, again, done by anonymous builders. Greece, perhaps. Tibet, perhaps. Italy, or even in China, there is something like this. The architecture without architects is a universal phenomenon. Actually, it can be found anywhere, and anywhere where people are still themselves without the dogma and the whip of bureaucracy, of committees that need to stamp your drawing to give you the right to build. You know, these people were not encumbered by such restrictions, and their freedom is manifest. Buildings Without Architects, a global guide to everyday architecture. You know, who taught these people to build? But they didn't need to be taught. The mollusk never studied for 6 years architecture in a university and builds magnificently. And so do the smallest insects sometimes. How do you explain it? How do you explain it? That the smallest insect has the instinct to build magnificently without going through torturous studies of architecture and exams and equations and subtracting and adding and learning techniques and so on. Who taught them? Look at this architecture. Is it architecture? Of course it is architecture. Is it beautiful? Yes, it is beautiful. But it was built by whom? We don't know. They didn't receive the Pritzker Prize. Now, this is, of course, built by modern man, the educated man. Is it better? Yes, the amplitude of the construction is impressive in terms of of quantity. Yes, we are confronted with difficult problems at a planetary scale. But why is it that we don't show much freedom? Because we don't. It's very sterile in a way. It's very restricted and restricting, and very inhibited and inhibiting. While here, it's life as lived, and it's imaginative. Yes, again, it's easy to idealize what is not yours. But as Fernando Pessoa said, it must be beautiful in Australia as long as you don't go there. So it's possible that if I lived in this little village, I probably would have been less appreciative. But from far away, it is seductive, and aesthetically speaking, is very seductive. Why is it that we build in this way? In a conventional architecture school, the student is prohibited to use such a cone. My God, this is seen like the extravagance of extravagances. Totally unacceptable. We don't have money for your crazy cones, said the professor. But these people were immensely poor, and yet they built it this way. How do you explain it? Why didn't they just build so-called rationally? With right angles and um, in our very simplistic way. Why? These are pages from the book Architecture Without Architects by Bernard Rudowski. I mean, I look at these steps, and of course, the professionally trained architect will say, how could this be? There is no parapet here for the stair. What if you fall? Well, I guess these people, like the person who entered the building, if they truly needed a parapet, they would have built it. But they thought that, it's just 4 steps, for God's sake. And of course, they didn't know the scientific objectivist formula to build it so-called correctly. But that's how people build, for their own lives, and they were happy like this. Look at this image also from the book. We don't even know what it is. It looks like sci-fi architecture, science fiction architecture. Is this on the moon? No, it's not on the moon. It's on the Earth. But it's very interesting. It's very interesting and aesthetically provocative. I mean, compare our blocks of flats with this, or even with this. This is a beautiful building. It has rhythmicity, it has regularity, it has columns. It's a box on columns, but I think it's very impressive. And it looks like it is, to use an abused word these days, sustainable. Well, yes, the wood was obtained from cutting down trees. That is true. But this is a building which, when fallen, it returns to the earth. It disintegrates, properly, so to speak, because it's built with organic matter, with organic materials. Did they know how to build? Yes, they knew how to build. This building is not built by unknowing people. I wouldn't even call this architecture primitive. In some respects, we are more primitive than they are or were. This is a picture from the exhibition Bernard Rudowski, Architecture Without Architects, at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. From what I remember, he struggled to have this exhibition for a number of years. The museum wouldn't want to do it, but in the end, in 1960s, they agreed to do it, and I'm glad they did. Again, architecture without architects. And I would oppose to the architecture without architects, architects without architecture, because there are so many. Now look at this building. It's actually flowering. It's a flowering building in the spring, perhaps. It's magnificent. If you do something like this today, it would be a wow architecture, and it would be published on all e-signs and magazines and so on. But it was built by anonymous people who knew how to build and who had sensitivity, and this must be acknowledged. Or here again, it's, for us, it's a fantastic architecture. For them, it's probably just a normal way of externalizing their needs, their desires, their wishes. This is a beautiful book, one of the best books I ever had and have, actually, about architecture. Is a volume from a beautiful history of world architecture. The initiator of this publicizing effort was Pierluigi Nervi, surprise, surprise, an engineer, but an engineer who was also an architect. And this volume is about what is called primitive architecture, which in my opinion is not primitive at all. In my opinion, our architecture often is more primitive. And look at this building. Is it primitive? I don't think so. I don't think so. I mean, yes, there isn't much asphalt around the building. It's not built with concrete, but that's a good thing. This building didn't pollute when it was built. And I don't know what its function is, but it shows clearly the logic of construction. The materials that I use start from, they are not imported from China or I don't know from where. They are from the place where they build the building. Primitive future, so Fujimoto, because Fujimoto talks about such an issue, primitive futures. This is a building by him that he proposed. It was not built, but it's quasi-primitive future, it's quasi-primitive because the shell, the wooden shell is still operating within the Cartesian system, unfortunately. But a desire for the primitive or primitiveness exists. Back to the real thing, meaning, architecture without architects. I don't know what this is. Sorry, pages from the book Primitive Architecture that we saw the cover of. Another page from the same book, perhaps other images from the book. The richness and the beauty, the ingenuity, the surprising spontaneousness of this, or spontaneity of this architecture is to be seen on every page of that book. Beautiful book indeed, and it can be purchased rather easily today. Anyway, esoteric symbology of primitive architecture. Now I would ask you, could we paraphrase this into esoteric symbology of modern architecture or esoteric symbology of contemporary architecture? What esoteric symbology? There is no esoteric symbology. In fact, this is oxymoronic. How could we have esoterism or esoteric knowledge or esoteric symbology in a so-called primitive architecture or primitive world? But this very oxymoron shows clearly that what we call primitive is not primitive at all. Again, how many architects today think of expressing through their buildings esoteric knowledge or esoteric symbology? You know the answer. Almost none. Primitive yet powerful architects. I don't know if it's so primitive, and this one in particular, I don't know if it's so powerful, but this one I like very much, very much. I love it. This is architecture. It's whimsical, it's fragile, it's strong, it's perishable, it's imaginative, it's crazy, it's dynamic, it's dreamlike, it's everything. And it puts to shame the timid, tamed architects of today, as this one as well. Now I show here a contemporary project by an architect that I know, Shakira Hamad from Egypt, but now she's in the United States, in New York, and she did a project for a tattoo academy in Melbourne, Australia, which tries to recuperate some of that spontaneous order that we noticed in the so-called primitive architecture or architecture without architects. And I'll show you the project. She studied also in Vienna at the postgraduate program Excessive, run by Hernan Diaz Alonso. And she did this project after she graduated in that postgraduate program in Vienna at the Institute of Architecture. She was actually weaving an architecture which in many ways resembles what we saw previously in those examples of so-called architecture without architects. It's a woven architecture. You see the plan on the corner, the right lower corner. And I will show you some more details. It's called warp and woof, like in weaving. And, I find it, she was also inspired by, this is a drawing she did, Shakira Hamad, in pencil, where she allowed her imagination and her graphic abilities to explore forms of organization which are not based on the Cartesian grid, but they explore what the scientists call now in nature spontaneous order. Another drawing by Shakira Hamad. Now, of course, what she does now in order to earn a living in New York City is different from what we see here. This is another page from her project in that competition, and again, drawings exploring, having different kinds of sources of inspiration for the project, and these are her digital explorations through Maya, where she was trying to weave, is like in basketry. It's an embroidered architecture. Now, of course, it's just on paper, but I think it's important to explore in this way as well, and to allow your imagination to act as unrestricted as possible. But this does not mean that in unrestricted, in unknown ways. Now, Benedetta Taliabue, with her Spanish pavilion in Shanghai, the Shanghai Expo in 2010, she also explored the power of weaving, and here it is. And I think she did a good job. Now, of course, behind this woven material, textile work, or panels, mobile panels, there is a steel structure. So this building is as a hybrid, physiology, but I think nevertheless is a courageous attempt to bring an architecture of surprise, and the femininity of weaving. Let's not forget all the goddesses of weaving were goddesses, not gods, for the Egyptians, for the Scandinavians, for the Greeks, like Ariadna, for the Hindus, and this is something worth contemplating, the femininity of architecture through weaving. Benedetta Taliabue in Spain, in Shanghai, but she lives and works in Barcelona. I chose to show also these few examples of contemporary work because I think it's important to try to connect, distant themes or distant realities with our own time, and see if it's not possible to recuperate some of the qualities that we see in architecture without architects in the present. Now, this is, something that is foreign to us, as this image is foreign to us. Look at those people, the builder of this, it's a church, it's a sacred building. Look at them erecting it, risking their lives to build it. It's amazing. It's an amazing picture. I mean, students study for years in universities and they never imagine the joy that these people, I'm sure, had erecting this building. Yes, there was effort too. Maybe at times frustrations, but it was the frustration of the discoverer, of the pioneer, climbing on the mountain of a building in order to bring it to fruition. Really, we think that we evolved formidably because we have refrigerators, we have cars, we have asphalted roads, we have so-called infrastructure. Well, but we'll never have the joy that these people had. No, because we are not children any longer. We don't know what it means to, to even to live dangerously. We are too protected and too cushioned and too afraid, essentially. We are afraid, very afraid. We are afraid to live. Look at this building. Something like this would not be proposed in a so-called serious school of architecture. No way. Or such a building which is not an insult to the earth, which doesn't pollute, but excuse me, it's not in concrete. How could we build something like this? Where is the engineer? What about these buildings? Were they done with engineers, with stamps, with signatures, with committees approving them? No, of course not. We complicated ourselves so much. This is the same book, Primitive Architecture, but this is not with hardcovers. It's a newer edition published by Electa Rizzoli. Itself a very nice book, and I would recommend it to anyone, by Enrico Guidoni. And it's one of the 18 volumes of the history of world architecture on primitive architecture, and in my opinion is the best. The sacred building, and the animals in front and the man with a bicycle. Nice. No heliport, no subterranean parking for 300 cars. Now look at this building, which is sliced like a bread. It was made actually of those slices. It's like going in reverse here. Strange. Other interesting buildings. We are going to see others when I show the Dogon architecture. Now, if we could bring something into our world inspired by what we call primitive architecture, or architecture without architects, would be great. But I don't see science of doing this, because we are too indoctrinated and too afraid. And plus, we won't get rid of our rationalistic Cartesian longings. No, we have to be in control. We have to be safe. We have to have air conditioning. We have to have a certain temperature in the rooms. In the winter has to be warm, and in the summer it has to be cold. And in the night we have to have electricity to deny the darkness that God gave us on night. No, no, and no, even to Hassan Fatih. And this is a building by him. But again and again, who taught these people the art of building? Nobody. Nobody. Who teaches a child to build a castle in sand at the edge of the sea? Nobody. Now you could say it's much easier to build in sand at the edge of the sea. Maybe, but let's not forget what Picasso said. I learned to paint like Raphael in 4 years, and I learned to paint like a child a whole life or a whole lifetime. So maybe if we learn, the peak of our development to become children again, that is to become again, in a way, so-called primitive, would be a great addition to our, archive of qualities. But I'm afraid we still have to be specialists, and mercenaries to only do things because we are paid. These people build for themselves. I'm sure they struggle. I'm sure they don't have refrigerators. I'm sure they maybe barely eat. And yet, the erection of this building in conditions of freedom, I'm sure was a challenge and a joy for them. If you look at that, I don't know how to call it, chalet, look at the artworks inscribed on the fascia of the building. This is inconceivable for us because we think we are emancipated. But it's not emancipation. It's actually poverty of imagination. Well, look at this building. Or this. Is it expressive? I think it is. Does it belong to the Dogon region in Mali? Yes, it does. No wonder it is protected by UNESCO because it is beautiful. And we are going to see other examples of the Dogon architecture, which I admire so much. And look at this door, at the entrance door. It is emphasized, its framing, which does not quite exist except what we see, through that whiteness, some splashed whiteness on a facade which is not white otherwise. Is it bad? I don't think it's bad at all. In fact, even Jean Nouvel attempted some gestures towards, this kind of spontaneity in one of his projects, if I remember correctly. Now look here. This is, of course, the house of a shaman. And this is a narrative architecture. The facade of the building says something about its inhabitant. A shaman? What is that? I mean, if we design a house for a doctor today, let's say a cardiologist or a surgeon, do we individualize that project, that house, according to the function that the inhabitant plays in society? Of course not. If we have a football player and a surgeon with the same amount of money, with the same plot of land, with the same requirements for their buildings, I'm sure we will not differentiate between the two buildings. We'll build the same building for two different kinds of people with different functions in society, with different education, different knowledge, and so on. Here, the house of the shaman is different from the houses of other people. The building tells the story of its inhabitant. That's what I meant by quoting from Gaston Bachelard, who said the mollusk doesn't build in order to live in the building, but lives in order to build the building. And so the building is a culmination of a lived life, is the expression of a lived life. And this is not happening in our architecture. Villa Savoie doesn't say anything about the Savoie family. Falling Water building by Frank Lloyd Wright doesn't say anything about the Kaufman family. The two buildings only say something about the architects, but not about the inhabitants. Here, the building tells us about something, and powerfully, about the inhabitant, not about the builder. This is a narrative architecture. And look at these whimsical structures, done in conditions of freedom, in the absence of inhibition, spontaneously, with some knowledge. And of course, the building has a cap, a hat, a humorous one. Nice. Look at this elevation. My God, who would do something like this today? Nobody. I mean, nobody in the so-called civilized world. No way. We don't even do sculptures any longer, or attach caryatids, or some kinds of statues. No, we only have white walls and the rectangularity and taint dreams or no dreams at all. But it's not the case here. Why? Because these people also acknowledge their inner life, dreams or nightmares, the animals that were to be found around the buildings, and they connected with that outer world in this way. Or here, a most unusual elevation, right? No student in architecture in a so-called serious school would do something like this, even in school. It would be considered crazy. It would be considered incomprehensible. It would be considered a joke. And it's not a joke. I actually think our rectangularisms are jokes compared to what we see here. Anyway, then look at the builders, or one of the builders. Or inhabitant, or both. It's possible that both. Aren't they beautiful? It's like a family. 4 brothers, or 2 brothers and 2 sisters, or 3 brothers and 1 sister, or 3 sisters and 1 brother, or the father, the mother, and 2 sons. I don't know, or 2 daughters. I don't know, but it's like a family. Dogon, yes. Mali. Life was and is harsh, I'm sure. But sometimes I long for this kind of life, you know. Now, of course, I long from a distance, from the comfort of our civilized, ambience, from my civilized, so-called civilized interior. It's possible that if I was there, I would not make this presentation in such admirative terms. It's possible. I have to look at myself critically as well. Dogon again, and we are going to see a specific presentation about the amazing architecture of Dogon. Mali, Earth, Earth on Earth. This is a sanctuary. But yeah, how was it born? From an architect sitting at a desk with a white collar shirt and or in front of a laptop, and calculating, subtracting and adding. No, I don't think so. You cannot make something like this in that way. And the builders working hard, sweating, but doing something real with their own hands. And look here, these builders. Now you compare the frustrations of the countless students who pass countless exams and never touch a brick or a stone, and never climb on the mountainous building as these people do. They erected something. Can you imagine the level of accomplishment, that these people arrived at? And I'm absolutely sure they were not forced to do it. Probably not paid either. Amazing. Look at these columns here. Would we think of doing such columns to our buildings? No way. No, we are civilized. We are highly trained. We are rational. We think, but we don't feel. That's the problem. We didn't transform I think, therefore I am into I feel, therefore I am. Not yet. At the most, or maybe not at the most, we transformed Descartes' words, I think, therefore I am, into I shop, therefore I am. And this is the plan, of a little human settlement. It's like the face, like a human face in plan, and look at the functions. The town hall is number 1. It's here, it's not in the center. Number 2, I don't even see it. Where is it? Number 2, the blacksmith. I don't see it, but it must be here. Number 3, village square. It's the square. 4, house. There are some houses here which the eyes and the nose, right? Then 5, women. 5, they are the jewels, the earrings, uh, some special buildings for the women here. in plan the jewels, the earrings, smaller, number 6. I don't know what is 7 village altar, and 8 other altars. Are we more sophisticated than these people? Do we have esoteric symbolism in our works? No way. Another, I cannot call it village, although maybe I could, very small, round buildings. These people must have plenty of money if they afford round buildings, conical or cylindrical. No way. They are, some of the poorest people on this earth. But why did they build in this way? And not with apparently the most economical rectangular Cartesian way. This architecture is kind of dreamlike and womb-like. It's an architecture that is clearly not estranged from the fundamental source of life, from those impulses that animate us, maybe perhaps more during the night when we sleep than during the day when we are so-called awake. But are we truly awake? I doubt it. Oh, we see here ornaments, right? Why did they go through the trouble to ornament these humble dwellings? Because it's in the human nature to quest a little bit for some beauty. That's why. The house of the spiritual leader. We already saw such a thing. Maybe it's the same thing. Look at details of the spiritual leader. I mean, that they could be seen as morbid by us, and they are. And if we consider the skulls as being unbearable to look at, but the spiritual leader understood something that we forgot, that between life and death there is an intimate relationship. Life becomes death, death becomes life. We are born in order to die. Other interesting facades. Now look at these buildings. Why did they make? It's clear. It's a clear aesthetical concern here or intention, right? Here and here. It's they're like faces in a way. And yes, this elevation is different from the side elevation. The so-called primitive man was not so primitive after all. Doggone again. They erected these buildings without projects. It's an architecture without projects. I don't know what this is, but I like. With these bas reliefs, there was a lot of work here, hard work, but artistry as well. Yemen clay architecture, a remarkable architecture, also up to an extent architecture without architects, although they had and have the masters, the builders, the knowing people. And they erected the mini Manhattan in Sana'a and other places in Yemen. Amazing, amazing buildings in clay. Look at them. These are tall buildings. These are, apartment buildings. It's absolutely amazing. Yemen. It's probably these two last examples are not truly belonging to the architecture without architects, although they didn't have architects, but they had knowing or knowledgeable builders in the place where they lived. And I hope I have other examples. If not, I actually have another presentation just about Yemen architecture because I admire it, and there are countless examples of brilliant building in Yemen. Now, this is a website, a very good one, Misfits Architecture, and I recommend it to anyone. And, from 2017, it had an entry, Architecture Without Architects. It's another website that I think I took some images from. There are many, of course. Afterthoughts on vernacular and spontaneity. Yes, there seems to be a relationship between the vernacular or vernacularity or vernacular architecture and spontaneity. And here I end this first presentation today.